Hello, everybody. This is Alan, and as promised, I am delighted to say that I finally have Robert here, Robert Thompson from Northern Ireland, on the Zoom call with me to talk about photography. I'm so excited about this. Robert and I met just a few short weeks ago over a question about Zerine, and we were talking about the stacking program, and turns out we had a lot in common and a lot of shared interests. And professionally, we couldn't be more different. And in hearing about Robert's photography, and I've had his books on my shelf for years, and getting the opportunity to find out about how he does all this magic was just something I couldn't pass up. So today we have his undivided attention, or should I say, he has our undivided attention, and he's going to tell us a little bit about this magic that goes on. Robert, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
I'm pleased to be here, Alan. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come along. And hello, everyone that's joining us this evening.
Fantastic. Well, we're so glad you're here, and they, I know, are going to love this photography. It is something to behold. Tell us, you appear to have a wider remit than most nature photographers. You consider yourself a natural historian first and a photographer second. How does that work in your world?
Well, to be honest, my interest in natural history goes back to my childhood. I was fortunate to grow up in a large parkland estate with a 105-acre lake and a castle. My summer months were spent round the lake shore looking at damselflies and dragonflies, collecting butterflies in jars, all of the sort of things you do when you're young and you're interested in insects. So I never lost that fascination. Um, so when I finished my studies in London, I returned to Northern Ireland. I got involved in a project initially with the university, and that was looking at mayflies, um, which was a fascinating experience. And really, from there, it was an eye opener for me. And I knew that from then on, the camera was going to be something that was certainly part of my life, and it has been for
We
many
have
many
that
years.
photograph, don't we? Or one of those photographs from the days of the mayfly.
Yes, I call it the game changer because studying those insects for a few years was the turning point for me. I've included this picture of ephemera danica. Um, it was the very first mayfly that I photographed all of those years ago. So it was actually taken on a Pentax MX camera with a standard lens reversed,
Oh,
with a piece of black drain pipe and the lens taped to the drain pipe, and the body cap had the aperture, the central part of the cap, removed so that it could be used as a bayonet. The whole thing was a totally manual setup, and it was hit with flash. And that picture is well over 30 years old.
my
So for me,
goodness.
that was the turning point. Um, and I realized within a very short time that photographing insects, then in agencies, there wasn't that many really, really good imagery. And I spent the next year looking a lot at these insects and photographing many different species. And basically, that's where my photography started.
But you photograph a lot of other things as well as insects.
Yes, as a natural history photographer, macro is obviously one of my specialties, but that is what I would call my sort of specialization. But generally, as a rule, I can be photographing and have done, hanging out of helicopters, photographing landscapes from the air, photographing cave systems underground. And generally, I cover many different natural history subjects and topics, um, both flora and fauna as well. And I think today there are probably not as many photographers around that do that. And I suppose if you go back to the early part of my photographic career, most people then um, that migrated to photography had a natural history background.
Mhm.
And if you look at some of the more sort of well-known photographers of that time, they migrated to photography, but they had the knowledge, the natural history knowledge behind them. So the camera was just the process of being able to record what they see and what they understand. I
And
think
you're
today it's quite different. You get people who take up photography want to be wildlife photographers, and I think the situation works very much in reverse now. And it's a steep learning curve for them, um, compared to pre-digital when you were working with film, when you
oh
tended
yeah.
to sort of have that expertise first, and then have the camera to carry out what you want to do.
How many books have you
So
written, Robert?
I've been involved altogether in about 13. Some of them are quite large natural history publications, 400 or 500 pages,
Oh,
and they relate to subjects and natural history in general in the island of Ireland. And then obviously there's photography books. So I've tended to specialize in writing macro photography books, and my early publications were photographed basically with medium format Mamiya cameras. Um, so that's where kind of things started for me in a more serious way. I've included a picture here of what's called a large rail damselfly. It's still one of my most memorable and one of my favorite images because it was shot well over 25 years ago on an RZ 6x7 and a 140 millimeter macro lens. And it's there is an image in my office which is over a meter long, where that image was scanned and printed. Um, I'm one of those people who did like film, and like a lot of photographers, then it took me quite some time to migrate to digital. I think when you were a medium format photographer, you had that discipline. You worked, methodically, um, and you didn't have the I suppose the way that digital works, where you could rattle off multiple images and choose an image from it,
do
and
you
you
think
got
it's made you a better photographer?
well, yes, you were a lot more careful and a lot more discerning in what you were photographing. That's certainly the case.
Do you still take the medium format out from time to time and use it in the
I,
field?
I did I did up to a number of years ago, but not in recent times. It lies packed away carefully with a multitude of other accessories and pieces of equipment that we all accumulate over the years and never really see the light of day.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I ran both systems. I started with Kodak. I was given by Kodak a Pro SLRN. I still had to buy it, but at a reduced price. And I thought perhaps this is my possible entry into digital. But I still took my medium format system with me, and I was doing a workshop in Crete. And after about 3 days in the heat, the Pro SLRN packed in, um, but the film camera just worked on. That was the early days, and to be perfectly honest, I did get some reasonably good images from that camera. So my interest from mayflies developed into photographing other types of insects, and I always had a big interest in dragonflies. and I've spent 30 years studying them scientifically. I've written extensively about them. I've collaborated with both the Northern Ireland Environment Agency in Northern Ireland and the National Parks and Wildlife in the Republic of Ireland, who have funded very, very high profile projects that I've been involved in. And one of those was the Dragonfly Ireland project. And we produced at the end of that 4-year scientific study a huge publication on the dragonflies, that occur in Ireland. So as well as studying them scientifically, I've always been interested, obviously, in the photographic aspect of them as well. So I've shot them both on medium format over the years and obviously digitally as well. This is a four-spotted chaser that I've gone out early in the morning, and I've obviously spent time looking carefully among vegetation. This is a newly emerged insect. You can see the exuvial case at the base there. And
It's
when you're
amazing.
working in situations like this, the way I look at it is I like to do a lot of my insect photography very early in the morning or late in the evening. I don't often go out, handheld shooting in the middle of the day. And the other thing I don't do really as a rule, I don't go out randomly. I don't have the time to do that. So when I go out to photograph, I go out with a particular purpose in mind, and I focus on that one aspect. I try not to get distracted with other things.
That must be difficult. I mean, I can't walk to the car without getting distracted by something in a bush.
Well, the problem is then it's so easy to get distracted with other things, and then you lose focus on what you're actually to do. So these are just a series of images of dragonflies that I've taken over the years. I also like to shoot a lot of these insects because they're so wary. Um, with longer lenses as well. Remember, dragonflies have changed very little in 300 million years. They have 360-degree vision. They can fly forwards, they can hover, they can fly backwards. I've even observed them flying backwards around a pond. Um, they've got incredible eyesight, um, and they're fascinating insects to watch, and their
Unbelievable.
behavior is extremely fascinating. Um, so I'd use a whole range of different lenses. I don't necessarily always stick just to a macro lens. I quite often shoot with a 300 with a tube on. Um, so I think it's important when you're photographing, um, you need to have a plan and an object in mind. And for me, I look carefully at the subjects that I photograph. If the subject does not fit the criteria that I have in my mind, then I simply don't photograph it because I know I will probably just delete it anyway. So I look carefully for the insects that are going to be of interest. I look carefully at backgrounds, which is a critical part. Um, that's why I use a combination of different lenses because that can affect perspective and how the background looks in the final result.
I'm guessing here, but the fact that we've seen the advent now of generative fill in Photoshop and in other programs where you can put any kind of a background you want around an image, that is not something that would be of interest to you, right?
Absolutely not.
Okay. I
I,
thought
I
for a
think
minute
this.
you were going to say, "Oh yeah, I
I
love
think
it."
I think this is going to be a huge problem in the photographic world in the coming years. I
Uh-huh.
think it's going to be a huge problem in competitions also that I have judged over the years when I've worked in the Royal Photographic Society. I think what's going to happen now is people or societies will demand um, the raw files, and they'll use software to look at them carefully to see how much manipulation has been done from the original file. Um, I've never been a fan, even when I shoot landscapes, I don't replace skies or anything like that. Um,
I
I
thought you didn't. I mean, I just had to ask.
no, I don't use graduated neutral density filters and haven't done for quite some time. I'll bracket and blend, and that's the way I prefer um, to work. Um, so insects in general have always been a huge interest. I've spent over 20 years studying and looking at moths and photographing moths from not only the UK but from all around the world. This is a lapid. It's one of my favorite images from my days of medium format. The picture goes back that long, and it just shows the species and how beautifully it blends with its environment. It's an unusual moth as well, but scientifically, there's no difference between butterflies and moths. They both belong to the same family, Lepidoptera.
Mhm.
Butterflies are just a genus that sort of occupy, sort of the central aspect of the whole range of species. But certainly in the UK, there's as many moths that fly in the daytime as there are butterflies. Um,
How do you
so,
even see that moth?
well, I do a lot of work with lichens and things like that. And sometimes when we've been out doing scientific work and people have been running light traps, I often look at species that have come in but haven't actually gone into the light trap. So if you examine tree trunks and vegetation around, early in the morning, you quite often find moths that are sitting there in their natural postures. Trouble is when they enter light traps, they get damaged.
Yeah,
Um, they're not that easy to work with. It's much easier to work with them when they're sort of naturally resting in their typical resting postures and things like that. So,
it,
um,
it, excuse my ignorance, but is that moth lying on its side to blend in, or is it?
no, 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 it's not. It's the structure, the morphology of the shape of the wings, but it's actually vertical, but it's just the way that the wings on the moth actually lie.
It's just amazing. Just
Um, The other thing I would say is, like any sort of budding natural history photographer, we all have those sort of photographers that we look up to. And in my early 20s, there were two photographers who came to mind, and I was always blown away by their work. And I studied every single publication many, many times
who
when
were
I was
these people?
younger. Well, Stephen Dalton, this is just an example of a couple of his books. He's a British natural history photographer. He's a pioneer of high speed flash. Um, and he has a worldwide reputation. He's a photographer who has pays a meticulous attention to detail. Um, and I was always simply blown away by the imagery that he was able to create. And bear in mind, there was no digital, and this was all done on film. Um, Stephen also at that point owned the Natural History Photographic Agency, which was one of the top agencies in the world for nature photography. He also had quite a large number of the best nature photographers in the world at that time. And I was invited to join it when I was in my late 20s. And I think I was the youngest photographer in the agency. Um, Stephen's still alive today. We know each other very well. He very kindly wrote the forward
Oh, yeah.
in one of my first photography books, and we've stayed in touch all of those years.
Do you know
The
if
other
either of these
photographer,
books are still in print, by the way?
oh yeah, well, they're not in print now, but a lot of the imagery in the books, I think, has never been bettered, even in today, in terms of digital. Um, his
I'd like
knowledge, his expertise, when you look at some of the images that he created, are truly mind blowing, considering that these were done on film, and quite a lot of them were done in the wild. Some of them were done in studios, but working in a studio with an animal or an insect, I think, is always much more challenging,
yeah,
actually trying to photograph it in its natural state, in its habitat. The other
absolutely.
photographer that I held in high regard was an American photographer called John Shaw, and he was active around that time as well. And I think a lot of people in the States will know the name.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and, and John Shaw was one of those photographers, a bit like me, who was a natural history photographer. He could adapt to any aspect of natural history that he needed to do. He was obviously an award-winning photographer as well, and I think he was. I think he won an Icon Award, um, as well as sort of many other awards, just for his sheer skill and approach to natural history photography. When you look at his books, you look at his imagery. At that time, it was nobody else was doing that type of work, and the most simple of subjects just were a work of art, with him behind the lens. And these two photographers were very influential, certainly for me. And I'd like to think over the years that they've certainly been played a major part in my own style, um,
Have
and
you
how
met John?
I've never met him. No, I'd love to have met him. I still have. I've every single one of the books that he ever published, as well as Stevens. They were probably the only two photographers that, when they were releasing a book, I ordered it in the bookshop before I ever saw it, because I know that that book will be good.
Mhm.
Um, I think John Shaw is still alive today. Um, he's probably a man now, I would say maybe late 70s, maybe even early 80s, probably still taking photographs. But
Okay.
I liked his approach, and I like to think that my own approach has been modeled very much on their style of photography. The other thing I think is important to say as well is that post digital, there's been many, you know, sort of great improvements in not only software but in how we take images today. But when it comes to composition and sort of looking at subjects, I think the rules back in the days of film are still just as
Mhm.
important today, as
Agreed.
they were then. So yes, those two people were highly influential, sort of in my career. Certainly, yes.
That book, by the way, The Nature Photographer's Guide, that is probably the most popular photography book in the States. You'll see that on more coffee tables in photographers' houses. I think everybody's got one.
It wouldn't surprise me, because at that particular time, those people set a benchmark that was very, very difficult for other people to reach.
Oh, sure.
Didn't have the advantage of digital, where you could take multiple images of things, run them through Photoshop. I sometimes referred to Photoshop as the hospital for imagery. You could put an image that wasn't quite what you wanted through the software, and perhaps get something at the other end that was
Yep.
more acceptable than you thought that it was.
Still do that.
Days of film, you either, when you were shooting transparency film, you either got it right or you got it wrong. There
Yep.
was no in between. I've included this picture because it's the larvae of a death's head hawk moth, and that was one of the first images I shot on the Kodak Pro SLR-N. Um, when you were using the camera
Beautiful.
at its base ISO, I think it was about, we're going back quite a few years now, probably to 2003 and 2004. I think that the base ISO was around about 160. Um, it probably was somewhere between 13 and 14 megapixel camera. But it did produce some interesting images. But the problem was, once you started to rack the ISO up, and I think it only went till about 800 or 1600 with a raw file, um, you began to see, you know, the problems that early digital cameras had then. But I still like it as an image. I like the posture, and I shot quite a lot of imagery on that camera. Moving on to butterflies, it's no secret there as well. I've photographed many species, not only at home in the UK, but also in Europe. I've run different workshops in different countries. So um, again, I would adopt the same approach. Um, I'm picky about the subjects that I photograph, and again, I like a lot of self focus. So what I often do is I tend to shoot through foliage in
Mm.
order to create the blur. And I often do that with a longer lens. Um, and I'm a tripod user, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Be a little
Um,
bit more specific about what you mean by shoot through foliage. How would this shot have been um,
well,
taken?
the plant is called lady smock. So you're in a meadow here, and there's quite a lot of it. So I've obviously taken a slightly lower angle, and I've had the lens relatively close to the flower in the foreground, and that's why it's kind of gone soft in the lower part of the image. I like that kind of approach sometimes, but you cannot do it with every subject. You
Sure.
need the right situation in order to do it. So you're obviously looking at some of my more interesting images. You're not seeing all the ones that are failures. Um, and no matter how skilled or competent you are with the camera, um, no no accomplished photographer ever gets it right every single time. I think that's something to bear in mind. The other important thing is the field work, the focus, and knowing exactly what you want is, to me, fundamental. The camera is only the last link in the chain. And I think people forget that. The camera is there to carry out what you see and what you envisage, but it's what you see with your eye initially and how you create that image in your mind, or when you look at a subject and you realize this has got the potential to be something quite interesting. That's where I think the skill lies, for me as a naturalist and a photographer. Um, it's up to you then to take those skills and try and recreate what you see. This is another example, again, in a bluebell wood, again, using the bluebell slightly in the foreground just to soften the emergent flowers at the bottom. This is one of the first shots Nikon let me have a Z7 II when it came out for a while. This was the very first shot I took with that camera um, in the evening time, quite late on in the evening. It was my first experience really of getting used to an electronic viewfinder when you're so used to an optical viewfinder. Um, but I've been fortunate enough. I've had imagery published in, various Nikon publications, including Nikon Pro and Nikon Owner, and I've worked with Nikon on the UK, and they've used a lot of my imagery as well. So the evening time and early morning for me is the ideal time.
Did you use flash on these pictures
No,
here?
no, no. Um, The interesting thing is, with some of the early Nikon professional bodies, I had the R1 C1 flash system,
Hmm.
uh, which I tended to use quite frequently, quite often as a fill-in. Um, But once I moved to D850s and then to Z9, um, my use of flash went down, I would say 50, 60%. I find that I no longer needed to use it just as much. And I'm quite comfortable pushing the ISO up on those cameras because you've got really excellent software like Topaz that it's quite astounding when you shoot at high ISO how good a job that software can can do with an image. So everything is moving along at quite a pace. The software technology, um, even the software for workflow, um, it's making the process much more straightforward. When you've got large amounts of images, I have to put a lot of metadata into my images because most of the work that I do with the museum and the various organizations will all be archived in the National Museum. So the importance of taking an image for me, be it in Ireland or abroad, is the metadata, because the metadata is what gives the image the credibility and the importance in the long term. A picture you can take, if it's got no information, in my opinion, it's meaningless. There is no link. But 20 years from now, if it's got the information from a scientific point of view, people can go and examine and look at those locations and see whether those species are still there. So it's as important to put the metadata in. Your image now becomes a bit like a set specimen in a museum. It's got credibility.
Do you automate any of that, or are you manually putting your data in?
Well, in the early days, I had to put it all in. Now, I tend to use Bridge, and I have presets set up. And when it comes to my own particular details, that automatically goes in. And then I have a series in the description field of headings that's automatically loaded. And then all I have to do basically is type in certain aspects of habitat or whatever it is, and then apply it to those images that are where it's relevant.
Do you like using Bridge?
I've used different programs, but I come to the conclusion a few years ago it's better to stick with a system. It's not perfect in every aspect, that's for sure. There are things in Bridge that I would like to see done differently, and I did have conversations with Adobe. For instance, GPS. I think if you use Bridge to edit your imagery, it seems more natural to me to be able to look and check your GPS on maps and Google Maps and things like that in your editing software.
Mhm.
It's there in Lightroom, but to me, that's the next stage of the process. I would much prefer to have that when I'm captioning the subjects and have access to
Absolutely.
that, particularly when you're working abroad in Europe and places like that. But they haven't done it. So um, you just kind of have to um, live with it. But the one interesting thing for me about the Z9, and I was lucky to get one at the very beginning when they first became available in the UK. I would have bought the camera purely on its own, just for GPS. I was so pleased. I'd been looking for years for Nikon to build it into their cameras instead of having to use it externally, which always caused problems. But I have to say that adopting the Russian-based GNSS system, um, it's been flawless and it runs on the fly. Even when your camera is off, it's running on the fly in the background. Uh, and I have found it to be absolutely first class. So I'm really, really pleased on that front. Moths are diverse. Obviously, there are so many more moths in any one country compared to butterflies. This is called a white prominent. It's it was deemed to be extinct in Ireland for 70 years, and then it turned up um, in County Kerry, and it created a whole stir in the Lepidoptera world. But what's interesting about the moth is when you go down and you find where it is, it's obviously related to birch. But if you look at the design on the forewing, birch trunks often have the bark that peels. And if you look at the structure of the moth, you can see the orange on the forewing, which is meant to kind of emulate sort of peeling parts of the bark. So when it rests on birch tree trunks and branches during the day, it can blend very, very easily, making it very difficult for a bird to spot.
Pretty difficult for a photographer to spot too.
Yeah, but when you've got your eye in and you're going around examining sort of tree trunks very, very early in the morning where a UV light has been put out, it's quite amazing what you can turn up. Once the sun begins to come up, moths disappear very quickly. And, you know, if you're not out really first thing, you're only going to find the odd one here or there. I've
Right.
done a lot of my moth photography like that. This is an elephant hawk, and it's a very, very popular moth in gardens as well as woodlands. And I've come across it many, many times. And again, in a situation like this, I would be using my 200mm macro. I'd be looking carefully at the background. And if there was something that was just encroaching, I carry clothes pegs and clips. And what I'll do is I'll just clip the foliage back sometimes to help with the diffusion. This was actually shot in my garden. Being up early in the mornings and just going around the garden in the morning, it's amazing sometimes what you find. This is one of Europe's most attractive moths. It belongs to the Saturnid family. It's called a Spanish moon moth, um, and it occurs only in a few locations now. The moth has got quite rare, but for me, I think it's one of the most beautiful moths that you'll find in Europe. And it's a
Really?
fantastic experience when you actually see one of these things. It's quite large. It's got about 3 inch, 4 inch wingspan. And then caterpillars as well, obviously. You know, I photograph all sorts of insects that come to my attention, particularly those that I think will make a pictorial picture. And it's just the typical posture of these early instar caterpillars and the way that they're hanging. But again, it's using a slightly a longer macro to help just keep that diffusion in the background. And then you go to the other extreme where you've got certain species of caterpillar that are so cryptic that during the day they remain totally motionless. And you can see in this particular situation, you've got this September thorn moth, and it emulates the branch of an oak tree. And it just stays motionless like that all day. And it's got a tiny little connecting thread, which is its lifeline. Um, and if something was to disturb it, it would just use that lifeline and drop straight down to the vegetation on the ground.
Oh.
Obviously, orchids, flora is another big interest of mine. And I've run a number of workshops in Europe looking at sort of orchids. I've spent over 20 years as well traveling and photographing in different countries, some of the rare species. Even 20 years on, going back to some of the sites in countries that I'd been 15 years ago, some of those habitats are gone now. Species are no longer there. But again, when something is static, photographers often make the mistake, if it's static, it's not challenging to photograph. It's not going to fly off or run off. But actually, it couldn't be further from the truth. Flower photography is incredibly difficult. I think primarily because the subject is static. And, you know, it's easy to put a camera in front of it and record, like, for example, the shot on the left-hand side. This was shot in Greece. But again, to add a little sort of extra dimension to it, again, using a longer lens, dropping the lens down and shifting just my position ever so slightly,
Mhm.
that's the same shot. So what I'm trying to sort of explain and show the photographers, you should look carefully at the subject, pick your subject, just don't take the first subject that you see, and see whether you can be that wee bit more creative
Yeah.
in your photographic approach. And again, the
Sure,
same
sure.
here. Offers Helena, same approach again. Um, there's a whole range of this genus of orchids, and the lips are totally fascinating. The labellums, and again here I'm using a 200 macro. I'm slightly low down. Um, Foreground vegetation, they're just sort of slightly going out of focus. Um, and in that way, you can create distance with your background as well, and it helps with the diffusion process.
Do you plan the photograph like that, or do you wait till you see your test shot and you have everything lined up?
Oh, funny, we were discussing this the other day when we were having a conversation. And one of the things I often find with photographers in groups when you have them on a workshop and you take them somewhere, they're excited obviously to see certain species. And the first thing they tend to do is when they walk into a meadow, the very first one they see, they're all crowded around it and they're almost queuing up to photograph it. Um, you may say we're going to visit 4 different locations today, so we will have 1 hour here or 1.5 hours. And what you find is they spend so much time on that one plant that they run out of time because they don't have the time to explore the meadow. So my approach has always been when I go to a meadow or a habitat for the first time, my bag goes on the ground for 15 or 20 minutes and I explore and look around and I select the best plant or orchid or whatever it is that I can find. I look carefully at the background. I look carefully at the structure, the condition of the flowers. Um, I take that all into consideration. And only then, when I've decided that that one is perhaps the best example of them all, will I go and pick up my bag. I think when you do it the other way and they start to work their way around, when they've spent 3/4 of an hour on the first two and they finally get to the one that matters, all of the time that they've spent on the first two, those images get deleted and never used.
Right.
It's probably wise to begin with is go have a look around, see what there is, and then make your mind up. And that tends to be my approach. And again, utilizing the same technique here. We're in the Pyrenees, in the south of France. Again, utilizing foreground blur and trying to sort of isolate subjects. It doesn't always work. You're seeing examples here of species that I've shot over 2 or 3 years. Um, but I equally sometimes take imagery where that I can't do this. But it's just one of my particular styles and approaches. This was a workshop in Sicily, and we've been out all day. And we're pretty exhausted. Um, I just wanted to head back into the hotel, and we were driving back, and over in a meadow just at the edge of the road was this profusion of Orchis italica, and everybody wanted to stop. Having photographed this orchid so many times during the day, everybody wanted to stop to go into the meadow to have another go as such. But I let everybody go in, and then I just decided I'd take a walk. So I was walking among the plants, actually looking at different insects. And then I came across um, this mantid, and I thought, wow, this looks really, really interesting. So I actually headed back to get the camera and a long lens, and was very, very careful because coneheads tend to be very nervous, but they do take on the coloration of the plant that they're naturally resting on. So while everybody had another Orcus italica, probably about the 50th one that day, when we had our meeting that evening. And we were looking at different images. I put this up and I said, while you were all doing that again, I was over looking at this. So it remains one of my favorite images
Oh,
of the species, you know.
it's just stunning. What is the plant that it's on?
It's an orchid. It's called Orchis italica. It's a very common orchid in the Mediterranean as well. I make no secret, probably, that I'm a Novoflex fan. Um, I think you know that by now.
I
Um,
do, and so am I.
well, in the early years, like everybody else, I own 7 tripods. I own a wide diversity of dolly mixture, as I call it, photographic equipment, where you buy one particular component from one manufacturer and you have a tripod from another, and you try to make all of these things gel and work together. And it took me a long time to realize that perhaps that's not the best approach. So when I bought into the Novoflex system, for the first time, I realized here was a company who thought outside the box, who produced not only tripods, specialized macro equipment that, to be perfectly honest, major camera brand manufacturers have now decided that's not the road that they want to go down. Pre-digital, Nikon, Canon had a wide diversity of macro equipment for people
Sure.
like ourselves, and they just post-digital decided that that was too much of a niche, and they decided they weren't going to spend the research and development in it to bring it up in line with what you would want in terms of digital photography. That's why you're happy and you're relieved that there's companies like Novoflex who have picked up that gauntlet and who specialize not only just in macro equipment, but they make a wide range of equipment, from panoramic equipment. They're even into lighting. They're a company that takes very seriously what they do. And from a macro photography point of view, their equipment is superb. The beauty about it is you're buying into a system from the tripod right through to an electronic rail or a tripod head or whatever you use. Everything fits, works beautifully together. It integrates seamlessly. Um, Even the color branding, they their equipment is all branded in the same colors. Everything just about it, for me as a photographer, works. Um, this is the setup with the Z7 II that I sometimes use. The beauty about the Novoflex equipment that I own is I have different systems that I can put together depending on what I want to do. So although this may look quite elaborate, when you look at it, it's actually quite straightforward in the field to use. So this is a Bellows. Novoflex make a retro reverse adapter, which you can see on the camera, and that is made to work with a whole range of major brands of cameras. So it preserves all the electronic information from the lens to the camera. In this case, it's a Nikon one, and I have reversed the 2470 Z Nikon lens on the Bellows system, and that produces some absolutely beautiful results. So even for a photographer who didn't have a macro lens, um, with the retro reverse adapter, even minus the Bellows, they can still reverse their lens, get an introduction into macro, um, and still retain all the electronic information. And most photographers will have the likes of a 2470 or something like that in
For
their.
sure.
Um, it's the whole thing is supported on. You've got the Castel Micro there, which is the electronic rail, and sometimes I will put in an additional rail like the XQ2, which just allows me to fine tune the focus very, very quickly. It's not necessary, but sometimes I just prefer it if I'm working at a higher magnification. The electronic rail has got a continuous dovetail, Arca Swiss dovetail. So you can just, that's another unique thing about Novoflex equipment. You're not limited just to a very short dovetail. All of their equipment has an elongated dovetail, and you can position the reel more or less exactly where you want it
Right.
before you start to do your stack. Like every macro photographer, the vast majority of us never seem to have equipment that suits our purpose. So I'm no different from everybody else. Over the years, some of it is in my books. I have made and altered and butchered various bits and pieces to get something that actually makes a process that I do much easier. So here we've got R1C1 flash units. I've used a gooseneck and a clamp, and I use those quite often on a tripod. And you'll see in another shot later where I use this kind of setup. I've had all sorts of flash brackets, which you can see in the background.
Right.
Utilizing a spike and a gooseneck. I also have used the R1C1 clamp, and I can put those spikes into the ground in a woodland if I'm photographing fungi. So, like most macro photographers, I've spent some time uh, devising, developing bits of equipment that help me get the job done quicker
Right.
and allow me to achieve the kind of result that I want. Um, this is one piece of equipment I developed many, many years ago. And to be honest, I simply couldn't work without it. There isn't really anything like it on the market. The nearest thing is a Wimberley clamp. But to be perfectly honest, the clamp is not something for me that I think you can realistically use in the field. Some people do, and that's fine for them if the plant is large and robust. But when you're working with sometimes very, very tiny plants with very delicate stems, um, it's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Right.
I'm using an elongated gooseneck here. Well, you can't see what's on the base, but it's basically a screwdriver. The hole drilled in the top, the gooseneck is put into that, and I've got a whole series of crocodile clips minus the teeth, and the
Hmm.
tension is reduced and changed on each of those crocodile clips so that it will clip everything from the tiniest plant till a twig. Should I need to photograph something that's on a twig, all I have to do basically is just change the crocodile clip that's on the front. So when you've got windy conditions and you're looking at a little bit of extra stability, that's the game changer. That's the difference between getting a very acceptable shot and having to bin your results because they've all got movement as a result of the wind.
Yeah.
It's for me, it's a highly important accessory in my kit, and I never go anywhere without it.
Tripods.
You'd almost think that tripods are slightly gone out of fashion, but I think if you ask most professional photographers, there are very few professionals who would consider taking pictures without a tripod. It simply
In the
generally
macro world,
doesn't
you're
happen.
talking about.
Yeah. Even landscape photographers, they will carry them about. Some of my photographic colleagues in the UK use very heavy tripods when they're shooting landscapes for a number of reasons. But I own two of the main tripods from Novoflex. This is the Pro 7.5, which is my main tripod. Uh, very, very cleverly designed. And the one thing about Novoflex tripods is it's what I said at the beginning with Novoflex. You're buying into a system from a reel to a tripod where everything works beautifully together and blends seamlessly. And the Pro 7.5 is one of those tripods that's pretty unique. There really isn't any other tripod system like it. They're actually called tripods. So it's not that it's misspelled, it's the proper term that Novoflex uses. So the first thing is all of the legs are interchangeable. So you can screw off the legs, you can have a series of different legs from ones that are much larger to ones that are smaller. You can actually use a different diameter of tripod leg from the other Triopod, which is their other professional, the Triopod M, which is not just as heavy. The base, or the spider base of the tripod itself, is designed in a way that it allows you to put a multitude of different accessories into that tripod. So if
Hmm.
you're a panoramic shooter, you can, equip the tripod to do that. You can use a whole series of different types of heads that Novoflex have developed. Um, you can even put goosenecks into, sort of screwed sort of apertures within the spider base themselves if you want to hold lighting systems. Um, the whole thing is just a beautifully designed concept. The other thing that I find particularly useful about the tripod system is when you're in situations where your tripod legs are basically getting in your way. So, in
Hmm.
other words, if you're photographing a tiny subject on a fallen tree trunk and you need to be in close, what you invariably end up doing with a conventional tripod is having your legs up in the air across the top
Right.
of the tree trunk because there's nowhere else for them to go. Well, just by removing the legs, Novoflex actually provide with the tripod a series of these mini legs. So when you unscrew your legs, you can put these in, and that will allow you to rest it on a tree trunk or be able to position the camera system right up close. It's very, very clever. It's extremely useful when you're photographing against walls or bridges where those two legs are just not where you want them. Just quickly remove them, put these on, and these can rest on the top of the wall. Very, very clever. The other advantage of these is if you're working in a meadow, for example, where most of your flowers are within, maybe 30 centimeters or a foot high, you can remove your legs completely, put three of these in, and just lift your camera system around. And it is beautifully stable. There is no movement or vibration whatsoever. I also own several different types of heads. So the tripod that I've illustrated here is a magic ball.
Hmm.
That is unique to Novoflex. That was designed way back in the 90s. It's, I would say, without doubt, the most incredible ball head I have ever used. And
Is
I
that
have,
it behind you?
yeah, I've got it there. It comes in three different sizes. But when you put a macro rail and setup onto that, it's so incredibly stable.
Wow.
It's unlike other ball heads. It's unique in its design, and it has 120-degree movement in all direction. No other standard ball head will allow you to do that. And a one-action lock locks it, and there is no creep or movement when you put a camera assembly on it.
So you're
So
twisting that knob,
yeah, like that. Yeah, and then you can just lock it in whatever position you want to do.
but that doesn't release the legs or anything like that.
No,
And you think the legs stand up to comparison with RRS and Gitzo?
absolutely. Um, but what you must understand is while RRS make very good photographic equipment as well, and get so sometimes you look at the price and you have to ask yourself, is it worth $2,000 or whatever it is, or am I paying just a little bit extra for that brand or that name? And for me, it's the equipment is very, very important for me in what I do. But I'm not interested in brand names or anything like that. I'm interested in equipment that
That
will work
works.
for me. Um, Not everybody will necessarily agree with me, and that's fine because we're all individuals and we all have our own different expectations. But when I go out into the field, I don't want to spend time fiddling about with things that just don't work properly. I want to be
Mhm.
able to set equipment down and work quickly and effectively. Um, and the other thing about the Pro 7.5 is when I need to get a camera right down at ground level, virtually on the ground, Within a few seconds, I can flick the legs from the Pro 7.5 completely over, and now I've got a tripod with the camera below within seconds that will allow me to take it right down to ground level. There will always be situations where the use of a tripod will slow you down, but look at it from another point of view. That's why I put uh, this particular slide in. I've always written a chapter about the merits of tripods in most of my photography books. So while the current trend seems to be trying to move away from tripods, what I want to do is highlight to people the advantages of using one. So for example, it supports the camera. It's also easier to compose your images accurately, which you can't do when you handhold. You can make minor compositional adjustments, okay, and look at them. You can work, where using a tripod allows you to work in uncomfortable situations that would be very, very difficult to handhold. It allows you to use a complete range of shutter speeds and apertures, which you can't do if you're
Right.
hand holding. Gives you the freedom to evaluate composition without looking through the viewfinder all of the time. The cons of not using one is straightforward enough. You're restricted to um, apertures and certain ISOs, which are not necessarily always ideal. You're having to work at lower magnifications because you don't have the stability. You don't achieve that consistency and accuracy in your framing because you're working freehand. Um, and you're having to keep your eye to the viewfinder all of the time. And obviously, depth of field is one of those things that suffers when you hand hold.
But
So those
you
are the
did-
advantages of using a tripod.
when you go out to photograph a flower, a particular plant, is your mindset this? I need to find the perfect specimen because it's going to be in my next book. Or do you go out to take the best pictures you can and then figure out which ones that you're going to stick in the book? Or do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's an interesting question, and if you'd asked me that question in the early years, I would have gone in and photographed what I could find. That is not what I do now. That approach for me now personally doesn't work.
Wow.
Um, I go out um, with a purpose in mind. I rarely ever go out with a camera to ramble about and hope that I find something of interest. I don't have the time to do that. But if I'm out working on a particular project, I will focus on that and that only. But I will look for the optimum examples of that. And that's what I'll work that day on.
Have
I
you
will,
ever come back empty-handed?
of course, yeah, many days. You don't get what you want, you don't find. I mean, ask a number of your photographers that follow you that are, for example, fungi photographers, whatever. You can
Sure.
go and spend, or slime mold photographers, which are very popular now. You can turn over 20, 30 logs, in half a day and not
Yeah.
find a single subject.
Yeah.
So,
Tell me
um,
about it.
yeah, if it was that simple, not only would everybody be doing it, but it would become boring. The excitement is turning over that log and finding something that gives you the wow factor.
Yeah,
And then you're quite happy to sit for the next 20 minutes setting everything up in order to achieve that shot. Um,
absolutely.
there are days where things work out that are good. And there are days not only in macro photography, but in a lot of the other photography that I do. There are situations where it doesn't work. But this is typical or equipment that I would use when I'm working with magnifications up to life size. So that's a Z9 with a Z105. I find that I don't use the Z105 beyond its one-to-one capability. Um, we had this discussion about lenses and flat field, and I think most of the modern macros today are not designed as flat field macros, and therefore you will begin to see some of the flaws that appear in those lenses once you start to rack the magnification up. I have
Right.
other systems that I use, but typically, which I carry with me, but that's typically what I would use for routine close-up photography. Actually, when you look at that, you'll see on the bottom there, I've got the Castellan
Yes.
attached to the Z9. So if I'm focus stacking that, I will not be using the camera's inbuilt focus shift. I'll be using the Novoflex
That's
Castellan.
actually the best picture of the Castle M that I've seen yet. That's very
Well, to be perfectly honest, you know, the innovation that went into that reel is truly quite amazing.
tell people what it does.
Well, the reel, I mean, it's the compromise between an electronic reel and a manual reel. I mean, you look at a conventional manual reel, and there are many different types made by many different companies. The one thing that you do is you control the amount of movement, but it's virtually impossible to be able to control that precisely with every single advancement that you make.
Correct.
Flex, being an innovative company, have come up with a reel that they have made all of the calculations for you. So what you've got is you've got a reel with a focusing wheel at the back with a lever that has magnification values that you can use from beyond 1 to 1 up to 5 times life size. They have already inbuilt the calculations. When you adjust the increment lever to whatever magnification you are actually going to do, you just rotate the focusing wheel, and there's a series of clicks which they have been precisely calibrated. Um, it's the most innovative, clever piece of technology in a reel that I have ever come across. And the beautiful thing about it is that the reel is calculated um, at f4, which is the same calculation um, to reduce diffraction
Mhm.
to the absolute minimum as the Castle Micro, which is the electronic version. So using the manual reel and the electronic reel, between the magnifications of beyond life size to 5 to 1 and the Castle Micro in that same magnification range, the results will be identical. Obviously, the Castle Micro has the capabilities of gone up to 50 to 1, which is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah,
To
that's
see it
how
in
I've been
real.
using it.
Yeah. And I have found, even when I was lucky enough when Novoflex asked me would I like to test it, it's absolutely brilliant. And it's so easy to carry in your bag. Not everybody either can afford a reel of this price, and that's fair enough. But that is the best compromise. And the results like that are equally as good as those within that magnification range with a Castle Micro.
Well, I can't wait to get my eyes on one of those sometime soon. It's a gorgeous piece of equipment.
Well, this is just an example in the field of using some of the different setups that I use.
You're
I
using an L bracket there, right, to support your camera?
Yeah, I have a Novoflex L bracket, a couple of those.
Oh,
That's what I'm saying. Everything that I have works seamlessly together.
I
So
didn't know
this
they
particular,
made the brackets as well.
yeah, they make L brackets as well. Yeah,
Nice.
and they fit precisely. So when you put everything together and you look at this setup here, there is no movement. There
Mhm.
is no vibration. Um, this is what I like about the system. So in this particular setup, I'm using Bellows, a D850. I'm using the Schneider flat field 4.5 90 millimeter macro. I'm using the magic ball, but you can also see that in this case, I've obviously been maybe photographing on the rocks over there. So I've removed 2 tripod legs and replaced them with the mini legs. And the stability is 100%. Um, so I get some really, really nice results with that. That setup allows me to photograph not only at infinity with that lens, but it allows me to focus up to 1 as well. Truly flat field lens produces absolutely superb results. Um, so I chop and change sometimes, just depending on what I want to do. So this is typical of the Pro 7.5. So when I need to get much lower, because with a conventional tripod, even when it's on the ground, when you add the head and then put the
Mhm.
camera on, you still, in my opinion, quite often are far too high.
Yeah, you're a foot and a half above the
Yeah.
surface.
So when you're looking to use a wide aperture for keeping backgrounds diffused and you want to keep things parallel, it's very, very difficult to do that. But within a few seconds, you can flip the legs over. With a 200 macro and a tripod collar, I can now rest that on the leaves if I so desire. And you can do that within just a few seconds. There's no pulling out columns and inverting columns and um, who wants to do that? I could be
Not
bothered with
me.
that. So this is what I like about the system. If I don't want to use those legs, I can put shorter legs on. So in my Jeep, I carry the Triopod range of equipment that I have. And when I go to do a particular job, if it's shooting landscapes or working on the coast or whatever, I can just make up the tripod configuration that I want that suits me for that day. That is, in my opinion, what makes the Novoflex system, Triopod system, so unique. Um, Nobody else has done it. Nobody else has thought to let's make a modular tripod
Mm.
where we can, have different components to suit whatever photographer's needs are and whatever type of photography that they're doing. And this is another example of just showing the Castle Micro in the field. It's very, very quick to use. Um, I'm photographing these fly agarics. Again, I don't use focus ring rotation. I am just letting the micro do the job here. And when you look at the detail that's in the different mosses, um, it produces just beautiful results with very, very few artifacts at all.
That does
And
look
I find
like a
it
heavy
very, very,
setup, though.
sorry, what?
It does look like a very heavy setup.
It's not, it's not heavy. Yes, it's, maybe it's because after a while you get used to it. But the only extra component obviously is the rail. But in that slight heaviness, you have ultimate stability. Another setup, again, you'll see in a lot of these setups, I use the magic ball because it is so, so good. So here I'm using the Bal Pro 1 Bellows with a D at 50, and I'm using a flat field enlarger Nikon EL 50.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
that's a very quick setup to use.
Uh-huh.
I've got a double rail on it there just to help me fine focus that wee bit quicker.
It looks like
Again, all Novoflex equipment, and then at about twice life size, you can go right in those tiny pollinia, um, and get a very, very clean result. With different publications, natural history publications, obviously I have to cover many different types of subjects. So when you work in freshwater or in rock pools, it's among the most challenging type of photography that you can do. I figured out a long time ago that bringing subjects home, even though I live close to the river, bringing subjects home to shoot in the studio can be very hit or miss and not ideal because you've got temperature changes in water. You're also using water that's not from the original source of where the subject was.
right.
So this is another situation where I devised my own setup. So what you've got here is you've got a square black perspex base with an aperture that's cut in the top of it, although you can't see that because I've got a tank over it. But I've got a whole series of specially constructed tanks. This is quite a small one with about a 1 inch gap between the plates. So for photographing dragonfly larvae and things that are quite small, um, I'm able to use the R1C1 flash units on their goosenecks connected to the wooden rail at the top. I can also use an additional flash overhead. If I so desire, I can put the R1C1 flash units underneath so that I can, adopt a transparent light or a backlight situation if I need to. Um, but the beauty about this setup is whether I'm photographing fish or small creatures, I can retrieve the subjects from the water, use the original water with a tiny little bit of filtration, put it in there. The subject behaves much more naturally. And when I'm finished, I can just pop it back in. And I have found since I developed this way of working, my success rate is gone up quite dramatically. So
Do you actively oxygenate the water in that tank?
well, that's quite a small setup. No, because I'm only going to be working with it for a very short time,
Oh, okay.
and I'm working right at the edge of the river. Um, so there's an example. That's an emperor larvae of a dragonfly. That's done exactly in that particular tank that you've seen. The substrate's introduced, and you can get your pictures very quickly, and then return it back. So these images have all been shot using different types of tanks, utilizing the same techniques. I mean, that shot's done exactly the same way. The only difference is the dimensions of the tank is different. But when I'm shooting directly in rock pools, there's where the clamps and the goosenecks come in
Uh-huh.
again with the R1C1. You can see them, they're on a Bembo tripod at this point. That's an old shot. I've never got around to redoing the shot with a Novoflex, which I must do at some point. But that allows me to manipulate the position, change the angle of the flash units. In rock pools, I tend to work with straight flash. It's the easiest way.
Mhm. Just
Um,
flash the whole pool.
yeah. If there's a slight ripple, I will put a large square clear perspex container in the rock pool, and that will reduce the ripple on the surface.
Oh, yeah.
And the flash will even shoot through the clear perspex as well. So when you're working on the coast, you don't have time because you're working between tides, and
Mhm.
you've always got to be very careful because if you start down at the bottom and you leave your bag and you forget and you look around an hour later, you find your bag floating past because
Yeah.
you've completely forgotten. So you've always got to keep that in mind. And the most interesting subjects will always be where the tide is at its furthest point.
Yeah.
So you've got to work there, quickly, and then work your way back up towards the
Is that where
shoreline.
you find the octopi is all the way out there at the edge?
Well, there are only a couple of times in the year when you've got the autumn and the spring equinox when the tides go out further than at any point in the year. Those are good times to go because you're able to see subjects that you wouldn't naturally see. So
Interesting.
that kind of setup, this is Blenny. That's all done utilizing that same technique. That's a squat lobster. Um, you can see the flash is just guided across the surface. You get no highlights, and it also uh, the flash going through the water acts as one large diffuser, so you don't get that sort of heavy relief that you would sometimes get with direct flash.
How much depth of water does it take to lose enough of the light to where you're not getting the illumination you need? I mean, these
Well, that's
pools
an
a couple
interesting
of feet deep?
question. The thing you have to bear in mind about water is diffraction is a problem with water as well. So when you're photographing in water, photographing at oblique angles and things like that are difficult because the clarity and of the subject here is different to the clarity there. So you've got to
Right,
always
right.
bear that in mind. You've also got to look realistically at the depth. So the deeper the rock pool, the less detail you can pick up in the subject because the lens has got to focus through all of that depth of water. So I find that a rock pool over in and around about 10 to 12 inches
Mhm.
is, in my opinion, probably getting close to the limit.
Wow,
Uh,
okay, that's a lot
if
of
if it's
information.
very, very clear, you can be very lucky. But when you get to that sort of depth and beyond it, then it's becoming a lot more problematical. Um, you know, again, these images are all shot in the same sort of way, utilizing the same technique. So pushing the boundaries, well, for me, I'm always looking something that is slightly different. And sometimes clients ask you for pictures that you don't have or you've never tried to do. Um, as macro photographers, we're always making equipment, but we're always trying to experiment with other ways to do things
Mhm.
and produce an image that is just not your normal average image. So
Exactly.
when I was given a Z9 the following year in the early spring, I was doing a workshop in northern Spain in the Pyrenees, and one of the things I thought would be very useful to try with the Z9 was butterfly or insect flight shots. And the problem is when you go somewhere like that and the temperatures are high, the butterflies are moving at incredible speed.
Mhm.
Uh, the Z9 did not, with the AI intelligence, certain groups of subjects were programmed in, birds, cars, but insects weren't. And it's understandable because when you look at the diversity and the structure of insects, eyes are in, depending on what you're looking at, in very different places.
Yeah.
But I was interested to see whether I could photograph butterflies in flight. But after a short period of time, and lots of failures, I figured that, well, trying to frame it in a normal way just doesn't work because these things move in milliseconds.
Yep.
Um, so repositioning your framing where you're starting basically in the bottom right hand corner and then using a fast burst to try and capture, but at the same time, you're hoping to try and capture the insect on a plane that keeps most of it in focus. And therein lies the challenge. I was asked by a client quite a while ago, um, would it be possible to reproduce a frog not diving from the land to the water, but actually completely in the water? We want to show the posture and the shape of the frog when it's in the water. Well, it's what I've said before. 95% of the success of an image is the planning and trying to figure out how that might be achievable. Um, Dalton was doing it 35 years ago with
Mhm.
his high speed flash units and film. And obviously, he couldn't see what the results were until he got the film back. The beauty about digital is you can see instantaneously that's a possibility or that fails. The problem with taking on a subject like this is I'm using a tank in my studio. I've got a high speed flash units, but I've got an infrared beam
Mhm.
uh, that the frog is going to break, and then there's a stone and a perch higher up that when the frog dives in. So you need about 7 frogs, and the problem is the first 2 times or 3 times they'll dive, and after that they get bored and then they won't dive. Um, so you're working over a 2-day period, and you can't stress them out because if you stress them out, then you get absolutely nowhere. So you get shots where they break the beam. There's a leg out of the frame, or the eyes sharp, but the rest of the body is not. Just exactly sharp. So you're
Right.
tweaking and manipulating your setup each time to try and reduce, the chances of that happening. And then 200 shots later in 2 days, you get this one shot. Now, some of the others are very good, but this one was the one
This
that
was
was
200 setups, 200 jumps to get the shot.
two, 200, 200 jumps over 2 days and seven frogs. Um, and just, you know, frustration, but I could see that I was getting some reasonable results. It was a question of just getting lucky as well. There's a certain amount of luck. You can reduce it till a point, but this particular shot was so good because the the legs are exactly in the
Oh,
right
it's,
position.
you know,
Four legs are swept back. It's
this
just one of those shots. It was the only one that was actually like that. There were others that were close to it, but not quite like that.
this looks like the mirror image of that John Shaw book cover from earlier. The slide with the frog leaping out of the water.
Oh, Stephen, yeah, that was Stephen
Yeah,
Dawkins' book. Yeah. Um, oh, he was certainly the master at those types
uh,
of imagery.
incredible patience. Can we take 5 minutes? I've got somebody at the door, and then we'll get right back to it. Just give me a moment.
How are we
Yeah.
doing?
You're doing great. I mean,
We haven't got we haven't got much left to go through.
we're probably in the realm of breaking this into two installments. I'm gonna do it all at once, but make it two video releases, and they'll go out at the same time, a part one and a part two.
How long have I been going?
2 hours.
Really?
Yeah, but there isn't a wasted word in it. You're a master at this. I mean, it's just pure content. They're gonna absolutely eat it up. And the pictures, everything, perfect. Couldn't be better. You sure prepared for this.
Well, I I I I just sat down for a couple of hours, gathered what I thought would work, and put it
Yeah, but
together.
I was talking about the 30 years before that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I'll be right back.
That's okay.
Sorry about that, Robert.
No, no, no. I was just looking to see um, where maybe would be the ideal place to split it, but it might be when we get to beyond 1 to 1, maybe from there. Um,
There is nothing that I've been listening for natural breaks, and there is nowhere up to this point that I would want to split it. I mean, it's too cohesive.
well, if you can shoot it, if it's 2 hours, I didn't realize. I thought it was running at about an hour and
No,
uh,
it's
15 minutes.
almost 20 to 7. So
But what time did we actually start the interview?
that's a good. Well, that was you. You're right. You're right. It's an hour and a half, maybe. Oh wait, it's got a timer on the recording somewhere. I don't want to press a button and accidentally turn it off. It's going to be. I'll tell you what. I am going to break the recording right here.
No, don't break it. It
No,
doesn't matter.
so that it'll start rendering, because it takes forever to render. Because I'm going to be editing this tonight. I'm going to get
Well,
started.
before you break it, just wait till I get to the next 2 slides, and then
Okay.
that takes it till another sequence.
Okay, then we're good. Come to think of it, how many slides are there left? We're actually on the last row, aren't we?
There's not an awful lot.
Let's just keep going. Let's get it. Let's knock it out, because it doesn't matter how many videos I cut it into to release it. It will just be more content. It'll all be so good.
Right. So it's just a question of how you'll string this together. So um, I'm going to start it.
You're at 48, right?
40, 47. I'm on the wasp, the picture after the frog, the
Okay.
wasp.
Well, I've got a perfect segue for that. So we'll just start now.
Yeah, maybe in order to pull that sequence together, you could maybe ask me something about how I did this picture, because we stopped at the frog, and then I was about to talk about the wasp.
Yeah.
So
No,
um,
I will lead right into the wasp. I mean, that's what I was going to do anyway.
okay,
Remind me of the name of that flower again.
so
Fuchsia.
fuchsia,
Yeah.
fuchsia.
The contrast between the frog entering the water like that and this hovering wasp is so stark. How do you get to photograph a single wasp hovering in front of a single flower like that without any distractions?
Well, it's an interesting story as well. I've been sitting out in the patio in the garden, watching the number of different wasps that were going back and forwards to the fuchsia shrub that was in the garden. And it gave me an idea that I wonder, is there a way that I could um, set up the infrared system beam where I could capture a single wasp going to a single flower? Um, so again, coming back to that situation where you look at the problem and how you might be able to solve it. So the first obvious thing was to we need to isolate the rest of the flowers, um, so that it's much more difficult um, for the wasps to get at. That was the first thing. It was then being able to bend a branch over with this flower on it, and clip it so that it stayed from the background. And the next part of the story was, what can I do to make the wasps, you know, focus on that one flower? So what I did was I mixed up a sugary solution and spread it underneath the flour, and of course that worked. But that was only part of the problem because you then wasps were so fast. You then had to get a wasp that would interrupt the beam, not only in the right place but also stay in focus. So it was an interesting afternoon,
Now,
you know, trying to
when I
achieve.
shoot these insects in flight, I use a high-speed shutter. Are you using a regular shutter on your
Yeah,
camera?
that shot with flash.
With flash, okay.
Yeah. That's realistically the only way I think in a situation like that you can do it.
Using a speed light.
And
Or
yeah, and a very short duration. So you're pushing your ISO slightly up
Mhm.
so that you can get a higher duration in your flash output. So
Is
that's
the
basically how that image was done. There were a number of different images that were reasonably good, but that's one of the ones that I particularly like.
the contrast in colors is fantastic. The background, quick question. Is the pink that we're seeing in the background from other fuchsias, or
Yes.
is that from the infrared beam?
No, no, no. That's from the other flowers that are
Perfect.
pushed away back. Um, I don't think my wife was too happy. She thought I was going to totally wreck the plant. Um, but
Beautiful.
it was worth the shot.
Oh, yeah.
This was in northern Spain, just experimenting with the Z9, um, capturing different butterflies in flight as they approached flowers and as they left them. Um, to me, the Z9 did an incredible job, considering that um, you know the AI is not programmed
Hmm.
for insects.
It
Um,
nails the eyes, doesn't it?
yeah, um, but it needs, there are, because these things fly so fast. You know, a lot of them, it just doesn't have the time to lock on.
Did
Um,
you ever find them locking onto the eye spots on moths and butterflies?
Not really, no, uh,
Really?
not really. Um, I have to say
I
that.
heard the R3, the Canon R3, does have insects programmed into its AI.
Well, I will be amazed because the diversity of insects and where their eyes and the position of
Yeah.
their eyes. Take some of the beetles where their eyes are actually on elongated, sort of. Um, I would be interested to see just how well that works.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Another popular aspect to macro that um, was an interest of mine, particularly when Laowa developed the wide-angle one-to-one macro.
Mhm.
It was the first macro lens that allowed you to show and photograph a subject within the context of its environment, and
Yeah,
I like that.
me
Um,
too.
and I do like that lens for that particular reason. But again, it's one of those situations where, for me, you use it carefully and subjectively because not every subject with the background makes an interesting image. In this particular case, with the female large red damselfly, it does. It's perched on the bog bean at the edge of the pool, and you can see the vegetation
Yep.
in relation to the subject. So that's what I like particularly about that lens, and I love using that lens with fungi as well. Um,
No, I
it's
don't think I've used it with fungi.
The interesting thing is none of the major brands have ever bothered to look at macro lenses beyond the conventional. I mean, Nikon for years and decades have their lens has been 105.
Mhm.
They haven't looked at it, as does Canon and other major brands. They haven't looked to experiment with other focal length macros.
Yeah.
The 200 millimeter macro was the first 200 macro that was ever made, and Nikon made it back in, I think, 1993.
Yep.
The value of that lens secondhand is the price of what it was new, and then some, because they stopped making it and it became a lens that a lot of people wanted. but
Oh,
not once in all of those years had they updated the specification of the design. They've done it many times with the 105, but not the 200.
do you find the 200 a little bit hard to shoot with?
I only ever shoot with it on a tripod. I don't handhold it.
Yeah,
Um, it's a good lens, but it is showing its age. So there needs to be a company out there like Lawa who are willing to bridge that gap. Um, and I would imagine a lens of that focal length would be a big seller.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
sure.
Well,
Again, this is just one of those situations you're looking among vegetation and you find early in the morning a resting brown hawker here. So the temperature's below the threshold for flight. So as long as you don't touch it or annoy it, you've got time to just carefully manipulate your tripod in. And these are the shots I think where wide angle macros work best. You've got an interesting habitat around it. You haven't got a cluttered mess. So you've got a focus point on the subject and you've got a nice relationship to its environment.
what
Um,
is that species that has the turquoise on its thorax?
it's um, you're talking about where the body is like a turquoise
Yeah.
blue,
Hmm.
a large. Well, America has so many. If you're talking about American dragonflies, my goodness, there's so many. But in America, there's a very similar species. In Britain, it's called an emperor, uh,
Emperor.
and it belongs to the family Anax. And in America, they have a number of species that are in that family as
I've
well.
not I've not noticed them.
And it's great in a woodland situation that wide angle macro as well. I mean, like here's the pods of a sweet chestnut. You've got a lichen here in the foreground, Lobelia pulmonaria. Um, and this is actually a focus stack, which allowed me to keep not only the subject close up and focus, but it allowed me also, because it was a very still day, to keep the whole habitat in the background sharp as well.
Beautiful.
So that's
Beautiful.
what I like about that Laowa lens. Use it in the right context, and it can produce some very, very interesting imagery.
I agree.
I use a number of different setups. It just depends what I want to do. And sometimes I like to work with one setup over another. But some of the setups I have achieve the same result. But when lightness is paramount for me, or I'm away for a long time carrying a bag, the Laowa 2.5 to 5x macro with the Z9, the Castellan rail, and sometimes another rail just to assist with focus is my ideal setup for working beyond one to one.
Still early in the morning, late in the afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to photographing static subjects or small fungi or slime molds, there's no hurry. I mean, it's not going anywhere, so you can take your time, set your subject up properly, or your camera and your setup properly with the subject. If the tripod legs are getting in the way, I put the mini legs on. Uh,
Mhm.
so I've got plenty of time. Working with insects obviously is a lot more problematic, and you get a high failure rate. Every now and again, you'll get lucky and you get very good results. Sometimes with moths, providing you don't touch them or annoy them, quite often they'll remain still throughout a stacking process.
Mhm.
This is a typical setup that I use sometimes with the Castle Micro. That happens to be a shot showing the D at 50 with the 105. I'm not using the Novoflex L bracket on that for some reason. There must be a reason why I put that one on. But anyway, it's on the Classic Ball 5. The Classic Ball 5 is a very interesting ball head as well. It's got 3 drop slots, but 2 of the drop slots allow you to have 180 degrees of movement. It has also got friction control, and if you look carefully at the blue band, you will see there are 5 friction control settings.
Hmm.
The beautiful thing about that is when you're using different lenses, whether you're shooting birds or whatever, once you've realized the ideal friction control to balance your lens and camera, you will be able to achieve exactly the same resistance every single time because these are presets. Unlike the vast majority of ball heads, you're constantly fiddling to get the right
Hmm.
resistance in order to get the balance. Novoflex again have been innovative here, thought outside the box, set it up into presets so that you can just click into position, and it works beautifully well. The other
Yeah.
thing about that head is um, there are 3 sort of different weights. So on the other tripod that I use when I need lightness, when I'm going to the mountains, um, I can invert that ball and socket, and I have now a panoramic base as well. So these heads, these classic ball heads, have a dual function.
Got it.
So
Beautiful.
that's a typical
Lovely setup.
shot with the Castle Micro. And as you find yourself, a shot like this is achievable because the micro will do it quickly.
Oh yeah.
And the whole process is done very, very quickly.
But this guy's wings are up. Um, he's not asleep, is he?
No, no,
You-
no. He's not. He's resting, but his wings are elevated.
that-
Some moths sometimes do that. Sometimes their posture, their wings are positioned in a tent-like position. Um, but
oh,
he's alert, and that's why in this situation the wings are up because the antennae are not swept back. They're they're in a position where the moth is alert.
so you did stack this in the
Oh,
field.
yeah, yeah. That's
How many shots do you think you took?
oh, I would say for something like that, on average, sometimes the micro, I just quickly put in the number of photographs and let it work the
Hmm.
stepping distance out. But on a typical shot like that, um, it's over life size. I would say probably in the region of between 40 and 50 images, just to be sure.
Do
And
you
then
ever use the continuous mode?
uh, rarely, I tend to use I tend to use the step mode probably the most. Occasionally, the photographic setting where I
Mhm.
select a number of images.
Yep.
Uh, that's the two that I generally tend to use. But having said that, there are the vast majority of insects. You have to pick your insects very carefully that you can actually achieve this. That's why doing these types of images for me either they work best actually in the morning for one simple reason is because the temperature has already reached the lowest point overnight. So
Right.
it's slowly rising, whereas in the evening it's at the highest point and it's slowly falling. So there is a difference in,
Definitely.
in the insect's behavior. And that is something obviously to be aware of. And then when we're shooting small fungi, here's a typical example. I'm probably working at about 2.5 times life size here, maybe close to 3, but you can see the camera set up on the right hand side, and you can just in the LCD screen see the setup. If you look carefully at the head of where the lava lens is, you'll see just how tiny that subject
Hmm.
is. And I used the magic ball again, total stability, and I've made the adjustment for each shot with the reel.
What
Um,
is the name of
I,
that fungus again?
I think that's called a white. We would call that a snowy disco fungi. That's
Excellent.
the vernacular name um, here that we would use. I'm not sure in America. I'm trying to think of the Latin name. I think it's Lactium virginicis or something like that. Um, I can't remember the Latin names for everything.
Pause for 1 second, please. Sorry, there was somebody at the door.
So that would be my typical setup. The magic ball, the Pro 7.5, the Z9, and the
Where's your light coming from?
I'm shooting with natural light there. The one thing when I mentioned earlier about cutting down the amount of flash, I
Hmm.
found since I've been using the Z9 that even in dimly lit situations, the contrast and the result is very good. Sometimes I also carry two LED lights with me as well.
Do
Uh,
you?
yes, I do.
What size of lights do you use?
Uh,
Little loom cubes or bigger than that? Oh, nice. Ulanzis, I think.
yeah, these are yeah. So I can either use my goosenecks
Hmm.
or I can use like spider legs. I can have a choice. Um,
Nice. Okay, I
so
didn't
where
realize that was part of the
where I'm in
choice.
deep woodland with heavy leaf cover, I think one thing with digital, you always have to be careful with the foliage because the foliage and the color of the foliage can affect
Hmm.
the color temperature of the subject. So sometimes putting a light on it is a wee bit of a game changer and takes that heavy greenness. But I
Yes.
think one other thing I should say, I do not shoot um, all of my images on auto white balance. I simply don't use auto white balance. I use preset color temperatures. That way, when you're stacking, you have continuity in your temperature
Yeah,
through
you can't use automatic and stack because it's going to change.
yeah.
A
And
cloud.
particularly when you're outside in the field on a day where your light may change, that's a problem. Therefore, I just generally, as a rule, since I've used digital, I have a set of preset color temperatures in different situations, and I just flick from one to the
I
other.
do exactly the same thing.
So that's how I do that. Again, working at higher magnifications, wolf milk, you can see the image in the top left-hand corner in the LCD screen. Um, you can see the detail that the rail is capable of reproducing. It's just for me, it's a superb addition to have in the field, without a doubt.
Yes.
And I don't focus or I don't photograph a huge number of slime molds. If I find them, I photograph them. These are about less than 3 millimeter. So we're up here at a magnification probably about 3.5 times. There's a fungus actually growing on the top of these. I think they're probably one of the Metatricia species. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. Um,
Allison will.
yeah. Um, so you can see there's still dew in the morning on them. There's a fungus that's developed right on the top of them,
I
but the
see
reel
that.
has reproduced beautifully the intricate details of the fungus that's growing on the top of them.
It's amazing.
And
Beautiful.
then in situations in the evening, like this one, for example, finding a resting butterfly, relatively calm evening. Even with the manual reel, I was still able to, I think I had about 2 attempts at this, but I was still able to shoot about 20 images, 25 images, and they all stitched together reasonably
Oh,
well.
that's amazing. What is the red dot on the Novoflex
Oh,
rail?
the rail, the red dot. The red dot is just the starting point.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so it's just where you can, so
A
that you know,
reference.
yeah, a reference, yeah. Um, well, we all know and have experienced clags. I don't know what they call them in America. I'm sure it's the same thing. It's only females that bite, um, and
Oh, horseflies.
horsefly is another another name. UK, we would refer to those particular ones as clegs. They've got tiny hairs on their wings, so that's why you never hear them like a wasp when they come. The tiny hairs that if you photograph them at high magnifications, you'll see that. So that dissipates the noise, and you only realize they're on your hand when they're biting you.
Yeah.
So, um,
I
but
hate
again,
those things.
it shows you focus stacking and what your capabilities are in the field. This was in a early in an evening that was incredibly calm on a bog, and you're just able to sometimes get everything to work for you.
Early
And
in the evening, at what time of year was this?
oh, that would have been probably late May, early June. Um, when you look at the picture of this hawk moth, it's the same. There's no question that given the right situations, um, focus stacking can be a huge advantage. But I use it selectively. I don't use it religiously on every single thing.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
and I am always careful at the same degree with aperture selection, depending on what I'm photographing, because sometimes you want to illustrate subjects with a wide aperture. You
Yeah,
don't want to shoot everything at f11 or 16.
right.
That was the old ideology in the days of film. Every photographic magazine and book said f16, f16. That
Yeah.
kind of culture's gone now. You look at things differently.
No, you want to isolate your subject. Like this moth is just perfect. You can't fail to have your attention drawn
Yeah.
to that face. Beautiful.
And then the last selection's really about fungi, and I have an interest in those. I would never claim to be a huge expert in them because there are so many species, and people devote their entire time just to
Oh,
fungi.
yeah.
I think this is a species called Astrophora parasitica, where these tiny mushrooms have actually they're parasites on another one. I think it was a lactea. So every now and again, you get lucky and you find situations like this where the subject's not going anywhere, so you've plenty of time to arrange your camera, set the thing up properly, and take your image. We would see this as one of the most deadliest fungi in the UK. It's called the
Mhm.
destroying angel, Amanita verosa. Um, but again, it's an attractive species to photograph.
Yep.
Um, and I tend to look for fungi in nice situations, and I always try to look for perfect specimens. If there's damage on the cap, sometimes I will place a leaf on it, which I
Oh,
think
okay.
adds to the overall composition. Sometimes the leaves are already on it, but I think sometimes it's a way of helping to disguise a very interesting subject that's got damaged.
Yeah. Was
So
that
it's not.
cat
So if you
at
look
an
at my
angle?
pictures in the future, it doesn't mean every single fungi I placed a leaf on it. Sometimes I do if there's damage. If there's not, then generally no.
Was that stem already bent?
Yes. Oh, of course. Yes. You can see the remnants of the veil there. That's hanging down just
Yeah,
underneath.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's very nice photograph. Very
And
nice.
then here, this is a good example of where focus stacking is useful.
Mm,
These are bonnet Mycenia inclinata bonnet mushrooms.
beautiful.
But when you look at the subject and where it is, to keep the background and to keep the smaller developing
Mhm.
ones in the background, that had to be focus stacked
Yep.
uh, in order to do that. But again, there is no focus. These are all shot with the rail. A rail. They're not using focus ring rotation.
Right.
As I've said before, I rarely would ever use that unless
Yeah.
I was stuck somewhere and I didn't have the rail. Um, the real for me, or the micro, is my way of ensuring that every step is precise and accurate.
Yeah, if I didn't have a rail and I saw this composition, I would shoot it any and every way I could to get the
Yeah,
images.
yeah,
That's a beautiful composition, so clever.
yeah. Well, fungi, again, they're static subjects, but they're challenging, you know. Sometimes you come across tiny species, and the first 10 minutes is sitting with a set of binoculars on your eyes with a very fine brush, brushing off,
Hmm.
you know, tiny micro bits of debris and dirt.
Yep.
Uh, you know, it's not an uncommon thing for me to do.
And it's
And
not uncommon to find these in dark,
oh,
difficult
yes, no,
places to shoot.
absolutely, and that's quite often the case, and sometimes you've got to light them, but light them sympathetically, is my approach, to it, you know, so these are just some examples. I mean, this is called a deceiver, shooting into the light, between, branches and trees has created this sort of bouquet. Um, don't always get the opportunity to do that. Um, this is a species, yellow stag's horn, Calycera viscosa. If ever a focus stacking program would let you down, this is the subject that I find most times you've has more artifacts and is more problematic than any other subject. And the reason simply is because the antlers cross over so much and
And
the
they're
yellow
high
merges
contrast.
into yellow. And it can be very, very, that's not a focus stack shot, but it can be very annoying,
Yep.
uh, you know, to correct those sorts of images. So that's shot with a long lens, probably a 300 with an extension tube.
Which one
And
do you
again,
use, by the way? Which 300 is your
uh,
weapon of
I've
choice?
two Nikons, about 300 2.8 and I've a 300 f4. So it
That
depends what phone
2.8
I
is a
carry.
big, heavy lens, yeah?
But most of the time, if I'm out shooting fungi, I will shoot with the smaller one. But I always tend to look, like most of my subjects, I'm picky, and I hope through woodland, looking for specimens that are perhaps unusual or slightly different, or where all of the other combinations are right, the background's right, and that sort of thing. So this is called candle snuff fungus. Is a species called Xylaria hypoxylin. I'm sure it's pretty common in America. It's one of the most common fungus here in the autumn time. It grows on in profusion on logs and tree stumps. So it's not that difficult to find specimens that are isolated and are that wee bit.
Never seen it before.
Oh, really?
Nope.
It is extremely common here. Very, very common. And then these are like parachute fungi. These are called collared parachute fungus.
Oh
These are quite
gosh.
tiny. This has to be focus stacked because they're quite small, um, and quite pretty. And the interesting thing about this is because they're focus stacked, you know, you're using with the Laowa lens, for example. I don't shoot it at 2.8. I will always stop a lens down. People talk about diffraction, and if you look at the mathematics of it, yes, if you're working it out mathematically, you could say at a certain magnification, it needs to be shot at 2.8. But in reality, is what I've said before, when you look at what people are actually looking at the results on between
Mhm.
their phones and screens that are capable of 72 DPI,
Mhm.
I've found in my experience that with Alawa, I can quite happily shoot at 5.6 and it is still super sharp.
Yeah, 5.6 to me is the sweet spot for most of the lenses that we use.
So
Um,
I don't, as a rule, with any of my lenses, ever shoot them wide open.
no,
I
I
always
don't
stop it
either.
silently.
I
Uh,
2 stops is usually the
yeah.
how do you prevent those those very fine uh, uh, stems on the mushrooms. How do you stop those from moving? Because you can't clamp them.
No, well,
It
try
looks
not
like
to
they'd
guide on
constantly be
it.
moving.
Um, when you're in the middle of a woodland, sometimes it can be to your advantage as well because the wind is kind of dissipating and is not as strong. There are days you go out and the wind is relatively calm. Um,
Would you ever put up a blind against the wind to shoot something like this?
Not really. In the
No.
early days, if you look at some of the techniques in my early books, I went to extraordinary lengths, and you got about 2 subjects photographed in a morning, and by the time you took it all down and moved it and put it I think as I've got older, I just don't have the stamina to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Why I
so,
gave up golf.
if if it's so windy, I either look for subjects that are going to be more stable or
Come back another day.
come back another day. Finally, that's a popular little disc fungus that we get a lot as well. It's called Bispirella catrina. It's called lemon disco fungus, and that's
It's
it's
gorgeous.
quite an interesting subject. So really, that's all I would like to show, and I'd like to thank everybody for their patience and their stamina.
Well, I don't
uh,
think you have to thank anybody, Robert. That was a master class in fieldcraft and equipment and lighting and everything. I know that people will have enjoyed this discussion. On that last photograph, what kind of spider is that?
I
That
have no idea. I haven't even looked that closely at it.
it's a strange looking thing. I don't think we have them over here. I
Uh,
just I figured
I don't
we.
think I don't think it's a spider. Uh,
Oh, well, there you go. Is it a mite or something?
probably something maybe along those lines.
Got 8 legs.
I, I,
Fascinating.
to be honest, I'm only paying a lot more attention to it now that you pointed it out. Um, that picture was probably taken a few years ago.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Somebody no doubt will know what it is. I'm
I'll,
good on quite a lot of groups, but there's certain groups of um,
when you
tiny
think about how
insects.
many species of insects, spiders, fungi, it's a wonder we can remember any of them. Well,
Well, you know, a lifetime is simply not enough. 20 lifetimes wouldn't cover it.
nope.
Um, but I
It's
think no matter where you live, the one thing about macro over every other photographic discipline is it's on your doorstep, it's down the road, it's
it's in the
whatever
carpet.
you want to make it.
Yeah.
It's not like landscape photography where you're back at the same location a dozen times because the weather people told you that the sun was going to shine and it never did. So that's the beauty about macro. You can do it in your back garden or whatever. There's always something interesting to see and
Yeah.
something to
You've
find.
got the whole universe right under our noses. It just takes a little bit of looking.
Absolutely.
Well, I
Absolutely.
hope that we can get together again sometime. I would love to talk about gear or anything.
Yes, perhaps we'll do another session where we'll keep it specifically to equipment.
I would
Um,
love that because I would like to see some more of your Novoflex gear. You've got such an interesting selection of cool tools, stuff I
well,
can
it's
really
built
draw on.
it's built up over a period of time, and to be perfectly honest, it's the best decision I ever made. Buying into a system and a concept where no matter what you're going to use works
It's going to work together.
seamlessly together. There are no hybrids or anything like that. Novoflex, when they design something, are very, very careful to ensure that that particular component will work and integrate with other components that they make.
Well, I'd like for us all to see that and see how the pieces all come together. I'm confused by how many tripod legs you have, so that will be one thing I'd like to get a feel for the tripods. I'm looking for one, so this will
Well,
be a good time.
I have both the professional version. So when I need the bigger spider base from the Pro 7.5, but I don't want the bigger legs, I
Mhm.
can lift the legs from the smaller one and screw them on, and vice versa. If I want to take the smaller tripod to the mountain, which I do, and if there's a little bit of wind,
You
I'll
want the
take the
big
bigger Pro
head?
7.5 legs and screw them on to the smaller spider head.
Yeah,
So that's the beauty about the system. It gets you away from, you know, for years having the dolly mixture approach where you
yeah.
had something of that, something different from another company, and
Oh
then
yeah.
trying to make the whole thing gel and work together. Um, it took me a long time to realize that that was not the right approach.
Well, I am certainly ready to hear the wisdom of going with something like Novoflex. It's certainly the most gorgeous gear. Very positive response from the folks in our Zoom meeting earlier today when we were talking about it. Maybe the tide is turning and people are starting to think of Novoflex not as an expensive company but an innovative
Well,
company.
they're highly innovative, but realistically, if you go onto their website and you look at the vast majority of products that they offer, throughout all of the different photographic disciplines, you'll find
Mhm.
that for those people that are living in America, um, the pricing
Yeah,
is not dissimilar,
no,
and in many cases, a lot of their equipment is priced a lot more keenly than some of the other well-known brands. Um,
I I mistakenly have been quoting, and I'll use this opportunity to correct it. I've been telling people that the Castel Micro is $3,000. The Castel Micro is $3,000 in a kit with the bellows. I did not realize that.
yeah,
The actual rail is only 1,800, which I say only. It's still a lot of money, but heck, it's so much better than the alternative. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm a
Um,
convert. I'm already pining the end of the year when I have to send it back.
well, the other thing is for those photographers who don't go beyond the realms of 5:1, um, the manual rail
Is good enough, yeah.
really suited. And it's priced accordingly that it's affordable to a wide range of people.
Well,
Not
one of
everybody
my
I
friends
know,
bought one and gets it delivered on Tuesday,
yeah,
so,
well, yeah, and I'm sure he'll have an interesting um, time with it.
he's in
Um,
California, unfortunately. He's not around the corner, so, I won't get to see it and, until
well, there will be hopefully an opportunity.
I
Um,
hope
at
so.
least
Fantastic.
you've got the chance and the opportunity to play with the micro, and
Oh, we're gonna be
it's a
doing that
phenomenon.
this week as we got an outdoor video coming up if the heat just gives us a little bit of a break. Well, thank you again for coming on, and thank you for coming to the Presume this morning. That was a real
Oh
treat
yeah,
for us.
no, no, that's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Excellent. Well, take care, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, all the
Goodbye.
best. Thank you. Good night.